Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Hello and welcome to Brave New World. In a few of my previous episodes, I discussed some of the problems that arise when people consume more and more information from social media platforms and are influenced via personal and political messages without their realization. In this highly connected world of sensory overload, how are we positioned in terms of supporting a healthy liberal democracy? It's a big question. But first, it's worthwhile understanding the history of liberal democracy and its core values. Have we strayed from these values? And what role do social media platforms play in the crisis of liberal democracy we are living through today? What are the forces that have gotten us here in the first place? And what can be learned from history? In today's episode, I talk to intellectual historian Helena Rosenblatt to understand the history of liberalism and liberal democracy, to assess how well we're doing, and to identify the challenges that lie ahead. As the famous Rastafarian philosopher Bob Marley once said, "If you know your history, then you'll know where you're coming from," which is a nice way of saying that if you don't know your history, you may not be sufficiently well informed to shape a better future. Helena is Distinguished Professor of History at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. She is the author of a number of books, including one on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and her latest one called The Lost History of Liberalism, which has been translated into 8 languages. Helena, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Vasant. I'm very happy to be here.
There's this Chinese proverb that goes, "May you live in interesting times." And I certainly think these are very interesting times.
You're so right. You're so right.
In the last few months, everyone's talking about the metaverse and we have crypto and all these kinds of things. And, the more I think about these, I think they're going to have serious implications for how people interact with their governments and all kinds of stuff. So, the social contract. But, hopefully we'll talk about some of that stuff too as we go along.
And let me just, I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me just say that as a historian, I like to think that every period is an interesting time.
Touché. Good one. All right, Helena. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Let's just start with that.
Yeah, well, I'm actually Swedish, and I was born in Stockholm, Sweden, to Swedish parents, but I never really lived in Sweden because my father was a diplomat. So we moved around quite a lot. My father was stationed in Moscow when I was born, and then was transferred to Beirut, Lebanon, where I went to the American Community School, which I absolutely loved. After that, we moved to Peking, China, where I went to the French embassy school, which I liked a little bit less. And I was there, by the way, during Mao Zedong, as a young girl. Obviously, I was about 10 years old at the time. And then, quite a contrast, moved to Washington, D.C., where I went to the public school in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which I, again, absolutely adored. So as you can tell, I just loved American schools and thrived in them. After this school near D.C., my father was transferred to the UN in New York City. And so as a teenager, I arrived in New York City, went to school there, and just stayed. I had changed schools so many times and systems, and as I keep saying, I love the American school system. So I did New York City, which I just adore to this day. And so I only applied to one university, and that was Columbia, and stayed there, got my Bachelor of Arts, my MA, and my PhD.
So do you remember much about Lebanon? I've heard that it was just a slice of heaven in the 60s and early 70s before the shit hit the fan. So do you remember much about it?
Well, I was 6, 7, and 8 years old, but I do remember it being a beautiful place, a place where you could, go swimming in the Mediterranean in the morning and skiing in the afternoon, in the mountains. The food was great. The atmosphere was wonderful. I remember, my parents have spoken very, very fondly of it. So yeah, a great place to be at that time. So tragic what happened afterwards.
Indeed. And what was China like? Do you remember that?
Well, China that was really, I mean, I could speak for hours about that. So I don't think I should take too much time, but I'll just tell one story that made a big impression on my mind. There was, in the winter time, after a snowstorm and an ice storm, there would be these loudspeakers all over Peking that would announce, big booming Chinese voice would order people to go out and clean the streets. And you'd see men, women, and children go out with their shovels and get rid of the snow from the street, clear the streets. And then there would be these, the anthems sung on these loudspeakers. This was, Mao, people standing on the street corners with their red books, waving them and chanting slogans and so on. So this made quite an impression on me.
So what books influenced you when you were growing up? How did you get to where you are?
In terms of reading, I was just a voracious reader since I was a child. And I think reflecting on this, why I became such a reader, one reason was surely all this moving about. You don't really establish very close long-term friendships that way. I don't want to make this sound sad. I was very happy and I'm very grateful for my background. I don't think I suffered too much at all. But I found my friends in books. I even, I read voraciously as a child. Of course, when I got to university, that's when I discovered the more serious sorts of books that I love to read today. I majored in history, read lots of history books, and then fell in love with intellectual history. That is the books of the great philosophers, the great thinkers, and particularly of the 18th century that I concentrated on. So, of all the books that I have read, if I'd have to choose one author, let me say, that's influenced me the most, it would be Jean-Jacques Rousseau, about whom I wrote my dissertation and with whom I still kind of grapple today. Incredibly deep and important thinker.
So on that thread, you've written this wonderful book called The Lost History of Liberalism. Tell us what motivated you to write that. And I'm just curious why it wasn't called The History of Liberalism. What did we lose along the way?
All right. Well, first, what got me to write this book is the fact that with my first two books, which focused on two political thinkers, I got to realize that there had not been a history of liberalism written in many, many years, which is extraordinary, given the importance liberalism has in our own world and how everybody speaks of liberalism. There are books on liberalism, there are books against liberalism, but there was no real history of liberalism with the kind of span that I thought it deserved. And so I was challenged. I felt like that was something that needed to be written. On top of that, I noticed that people were using this word in lots of different ways. I mean, why is it that liberalism means one thing in America, and colloquially it means sort of big government, and the rest of the world it means almost the opposite, sort of small government, and yet everybody kind of doesn't seem to acknowledge it. And I wanted to explain, why did this happen? What caused these two streams of liberalism to be invented? And why is there this confusion? And can I straighten it out? When was liberalism really conceptualized? And how did it develop over time, if it did? That challenged me, and I got to work. It took me a long time, a lot of research.
So when was it conceptualized? One of the things I really enjoyed about your book was, what a messy history France has had. Great quotes in there, one from Tocqueville, that says we are sleeping on a volcano. And prior to that, it had been a mess since the French Revolution and actually way before that as well. So tell us a little bit about, when did liberalism come into existence?
Yeah, and well, thanks for that. And you're so right. The focus on France may surprise some people because we tend to think of liberalism as an Anglo-American tradition. We somehow have picked that up kind of easily and spontaneously. And what my book shows is really no. It was born in France. The word you first find the word liberalism around 1812 or 1813, and it refers to a like a cluster of concepts that were conceptualized in response to the French Revolution. So if we like to think of great liberal thinkers being, John Locke, for example, well, he's only after the fact considered liberal because liberalism didn't exist in his lifetime. Liberalism came into being as a result of the French Revolution. And so my book explains how this happened. And you're right, it's a messy history. The word was always associated for a very long time. The word liberalism was associated with revolution and with the French Revolution. And then, as you know, liberalism was reconceptualized 50 or so years later after the revolution, so mid to late century, with the help of German thinkers. So this is also kind of surprising to people because people have not really gone looking for a liberal tradition in Germany. Germany is very often thought to have an illiberal culture and tradition because of what happened in the 20th century, basically. Yeah, liberalism owes a great deal to France. And everybody knew that at the time. Throughout the 19th century, in America and in England, people even would spell liberal with an E at the end or write it in italics because it was something that was foreign and a little bit dangerous even. To be liberal was to be revolutionary, maybe. Liberalism was something French, not something foreign. The word liberal, of course, has a non-political meaning too, and that people were familiar with. Liberal meaning generous, for example, being broad-minded. That word people used in America, of course, and in Britain and all over, and didn't associate necessarily with the revolution. But the political meaning of liberal, as meaning a bundle of concepts, I like to say, freedom, individual rights, all of these things, that was a product of the French Revolution and 19th century France.
Wow. Thanks for that elegant summary. Yeah, liberal sounds like a good word to me. Sounds good, right? It's good to be liberal. I'd love to be liberal.
It does. It does. And the funny thing is, it's good. It's funny you say that because when this group of French statesmen and writers like Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël, for example, start using the word liberal in this political sense, saying we are liberal, we are the liberal party, the conservatives get really angry and say like, you're kidnapping, you're hijacking this word, you're not liberal, you're anarchists, or you're bad people. You can't call yourself liberal. We're the liberals. We're the generous, magnanimous ones. So there was this moment where the politicization of the word was very kind of controversial. And I wonder, the early liberals clearly liked that the word had this positive connotation as well when they started to call themselves liberal.
So when did liberalism become American? Why do we think of it as being Anglo-American?
It becomes Anglo-American and becomes Americanized in the 20th century because of the rise of America to great power status and the Anglo-American alliance in World War I and World War II, and then the Cold War. Liberal democracy becomes what America really stands for, what it defends, and it becomes something that is also discussed in Western civilization courses, for example, in colleges. You didn't have that before. These chapters on America and liberal democracy appear then also in political science journals and encyclopedias. And it's a way, again, to describe what America stands for in relation, for example, to the rising totalitarian threat in Europe. Liberal democracy becomes the other because of its and now its emphasis on individual rights becomes ever more important, and property rights. You can imagine with the rise of totalitarianism, first Nazism, then Stalinism, it becomes important to emphasize this part of the liberal tradition, the property rights and the individual, and America as the great defender and exporter of these principles. And you see it, in Woodrow Wilson's speeches. You see it eventually in FDR being called, a great liberal. And so, yeah, it happens relatively late in the game, having been a foreign.
So that's really interesting because I'm gathering that liberals were actually elitist originally, right? I mean, you don't tend to think of liberals as elitist, but they were, right? Because they were worried about universal suffrage. Did I interpret that right
Yeah,
from
and
your book?
even today, there's this idea that liberalism is elitist, and there's some truth to this. Going far back, liberals thought of themselves as gentlemen, as opposed to the sort of unthinking crowd. These were propertied, educated gentlemen were the liberals, and they were never. Liberalism was really until again fairly recently. Now I'm talking about the late 19th century for democracy. These are two separate traditions. Liberal democracy. We use these words now, this concept, liberal democracy, as if it's unproblematic, right? That it goes together. Some
Right.
people even think of them as synonyms, liberalism and democracy, and Democrats and liberals. But it's really a problematic relationship. Democracy goes all the way back to ancient Greece, right, where it meant people power. Um, Unmediated, direct people power. Citizens went to the assembly and voted on legislation. They didn't vote for representatives. Over time, they had the concept of representative democracy, right? But for very long, for thousands of years, democracy was considered the worst form of government because it involved these unthinking masses ruling themselves, which was very hard to imagine also in large countries. Eventually, though, democracy in the sense of every man having a vote for a representative takes on and is implemented by actually dictators like Napoleon III. Liberals now, when you get liberal democracy, it means a democracy that has been tamed, a democracy that is safe for individuals, that have these safeguards built in, individual rights, freedom of press, freedom of religion, balance of power, and such things, to really, protect against this unthinking kind of crowd that lack capacity. Capacity is a word that you often hear. The liberals are constantly saying that people need capacity in order to vote and in order to participate, and that the masses don't have this capacity. So you're right. There is a certain amount of elitism in the story that I tell, and I don't know if it might still be there or not today.
Yeah, so these sound, I guess to some extent, these sound sort of uniquely American or even Anglo-American, right? So some of these new things you're talking about, protection of the individual and property rights and stuff like that, as opposed to illiberal
Yeah,
democracy.
yeah, absolutely. We hear now about illiberal democracies. Some people are even proud to say they're like Viktor Orban in Hungary proudly trumpets the fact that he stands for illiberal democracy, because liberalism now has been so, Americanized over the years and so kind of westernized that and so focused on individual rights that people can accuse it of being sort of a Western imperialism, and that's when all for individual rights, women's rights, gay rights, all of these things that they reject, populists and dictators.
So, how would you rate the health of liberal democracy in America these days? You talked about the necessity of people having the capacity to vote, but what we saw a year ago was a mob storming Capitol Hill protesting the democratic process. We've seen a rise in populism. It's a real ironic that authoritarian governments are finding so much ammunition against liberal democracy as a form of government. Perhaps our less than stellar record with handling COVID didn't help either. Are you concerned at all?
Well, like many people, I'm very worried. Of course, it's all over. Books are being written about it, and articles are being written about it. Liberal democracy is in crisis, and we see this rise of populism around the world. I just mentioned Hungary, but we see it in America as well. We've got our own version of populism, the Trump phenomenon, for example. But we have other problems: the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the sense that the system is leaving so many people behind. American leadership around the world is in question. And on the other hand, you've got, also consumerism rampant, something that Tocqueville wrote about and worried very much about. I worry about, on top of all of these things, a kind of despondence or skepticism about the political system. We say that it's broken, but let's try to fix it. I'm just worried that people are withdrawing more and more. And with this, there's this polarization and this anger out there. Some people are just being disenchanted altogether with liberal democracy. And I see with horror, there are statistics showing that young people think that maybe, this is hard to believe, but there are statistics saying that young people are thinking that maybe a military government would be okay. It would be more efficient, sort things out. Liberal democracy is messy. It's not working. And this is dangerous too. So for all these reasons, and probably more that I haven't mentioned just now, because there's so many, we're in a serious situation. I haven't even mentioned your expertise in the area of technology. Are we ready for these mammoth changes that are taking place in this world of automation and in the internet? I mean, that's really your area of expertise. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about the brave new world that we're facing.
That's a great question. And I guess if you were to ask, what do I think about it? The question is like, along what dimensions are we talking about? Are we talking about its impact on, let's say, the need for an informed electorate?
Yeah, precisely.
Is that kind of...
Yeah, well, I would. There's many ways to take this to this question. We've been speaking about liberalism and liberal democracy, and there are these two streams. I'm not sure I was able to express myself clearly on this, but at a certain point in liberalism's history, two streams were created. One that was very much for free markets, deregulation, and the other one more for government intervention. And this happened in the late 19th century with industrial revolution, urbanization, and the rise of a working class that was but stuck in poverty. And some liberals then started to say we have to intervene and make it possible for these to rise. And so they got more into regulation. And it was this liberalism that came to America. That's a long-winded way of saying I'd like to hear you speak about the internet and maybe the need for regulation?
Great question. So despite the wonders of the internet, it's created a couple of problems. So first, platforms have become weaponized, which is something I discussed with my guests Arun Sundarajan and Nandan Nilekani. Platforms can also be used for manipulation at scale, where truth and misinformation are blended cleverly, which came up in my conversation with Sinan Aral. But there's no smoking gun yet. And the big tech platforms have become powerful enough to thwart regulation, which is hard enough to craft in the first place. And with people getting more and more of their news from social media platforms, people aren't paying enough attention to the free and independent press. And in the meantime, the kinds of polarization that these platforms have engendered could be impacting free will and the democratic process quite adversely. It's actually related to some of the concerns of liberalism you mentioned historically, of people losing the capacity required in a liberal democracy.
Yeah, so my guys, early 19th century, throughout the 19th century, were very opposed to censorship, for example. This is freedom of the press was something they worked for, they stood for. I mean, it's a core liberal principle, right? So how do you feel about that in the internet?
That really worries me, and I'm glad you brought that up, because more and more people now are getting their information from social media. So 80s, 90s, you'd had these, the major networks, the news used to be reported by trustworthy looking people, usually men, and it was reported in somber tones. It was kind of reported. And I think the difference now is that news isn't reported, it's created, and it's created by a combination of humans and algorithms. And, you wonder, how that's going to impact, democracy. But it seems to me that that's a problem. Amazon owns Washington Post now. Tomorrow Google could very well own NBC or CBS, right? So I think this free press, independent verification, all that kind of stuff, I think there's a danger that that's being diluted. I think, as you've said, that's critical to the health of a liberal democracy, right? So, yeah, I do worry about that.
The circulation of untruths. The problem of fake news has existed from the beginning of newspapers, right? Because and there's been inflammatory press, and there's been the propaganda from Adam and Eve, all the way back. People have been trying to manipulate people and get them to do stuff, and politicians have tried to use this. But it just seems like, I mean, there was very few people could even read in the 18th century. So you're and then in the 19th, this group, but you're dealing with a different group. Now it's just mass. You have young people, you have teenagers, you have children being manipulated and being kind of, you've had podcasts about this, the influence it's having on mental health, even the rampant consumerism. How much time are people spending shopping as opposed to reading good books and so on?
Right. Yeah. No. And there's this other thing called Section 230 that I've written about as well, and sometimes that almost turns into a rant. But the truth is that I don't think lawmakers really understand the world that they're trying to regulate, and maybe that's part of the problem as well. When I talk to my students, they understand this brave new world of tech. They sort of understand the way it's going. They understand what these new streaming platforms are about. Platforms like, I talked about Amazon owning the Washington Post, but they also own the streaming platform called Twitch. So it's just a whole sort of new world of tech that's emerging. Lawmakers don't seem to understand this. And earlier in our conversation, I mentioned, the metaverse and crypto. And the implications of that are just mind-boggling. And I'm just trying to get my head around that, because in a sense, what that does is geographic affinity is replaced by sort of some other type of affinity, right? You might actually have more in common with someone in some remote part of the world than you do with your neighbor based on some affinity. And now with sort of this, decentralized internet emerging, you've got the ability to, fund movements all over the world without government knowing. Right? Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I don't know. In some ways, it's a good thing. But in some ways, it leaves, what does it even mean to be a citizen, right? Where are your rights? Where are your obligations? In your book, you talk about patriotism, which is a good thing. Does that even exist, to the degree that it needs to, right? I mean, I think, there's this sort of rights and obligations. And I know you've written about obligations as well.
Yeah, that's something that I'm glad you bring up, the question of rights and obligations. When liberalism became Americanized, and as a result of the world wars and this rise of totalitarianism, I was mentioning how John Locke became important, how individual rights became so important. You can understand in the context of growing totalitarianism threat around the world why Americans would emphasize individual rights so much. But I believe that as a consequence, duties were neglected somewhat. Whereas if you look at the history of what it has meant to be a liberal that I trace in the book, it hasn't just meant individual rights, it's also meant duties to the Commonwealth. And there wasn't one liberal that I read or that did not mention the importance of a generosity and of thinking of the common good. And this I'm surprised in America how much of our issues are even framed in the language of rights, and how it's kind of, and I would say that liberals in many ways have kind of abdicated the whole idea of patriotism. And I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly to the conservatives who seem to be better. Republicans are very good at sort of patriotism and the troops and all of that, whereas liberals, at least, in these universities that you and I teach in, are kind of skeptical about this sort of language at all,
So why is that? Is that because, I want to actually tie this to religion. Did religion play some role in, imbuing some sense of obligation in a liberal democracy? What was the role of religion?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So liberals have been engaged with religion from the very beginning, as you can imagine. I mean, it's not possible to understand any political thought until fairly recently if you didn't know something about religion. It was so much part of the culture and the way they were educated, and even the language they spoke, the words. So liberals were generally the first ones, the founders. People like Benjamin Constant and Madame de Stael, these French theorists, were really opponents of the Catholic Church. So there's a lot of critique of religion, of Catholicism, particularly in their works, and they're fighting for freedom, freedom of religion. This is also because the Church had such tremendous power and had been so supportive of the absolute monarchy for centuries. And the interesting thing is how many early liberals were Protestants. And it makes sense because they were a minority. They were prejudiced against. It was, illegal to be a Protestant in France until really the French Revolution. So they would be for individual rights. But talking about duties and obligations, one of the things that these Protestants, these liberals, if they were attacking the church and Catholicism, it did not mean they were irreligious. They weren't atheists. They weren't anti-religious when they were being anti-Catholic Church. They believed in what they would call a kind of, funnily enough, they did call a liberal Protestantism, a kind of religion that was more conducive to civic values, a kind of religion that focused on being a good person in this life rather than praying for, going to heaven or spending a lot of time on your knees in a church reciting prayers, practicing the virtues of a generous and involved citizen. So they wanted that kind of religion. They actually designed some religions. It's a fascinating period where they actually create, and Freemasonry really took off during this period, various sort of religious or quasi-religious ways of educating people to civic values, which they thought were so important.
Would you say that it's liberalism is a Protestant thing?
Well, great that you should say that. I mean, an extraordinary number of liberals throughout the 19th century, and certainly the founders, were Protestant, in fact. This doesn't mean that there weren't Catholics who were liberal. They were, but they kept being, excommunicated or threatened by excommunication by the Pope. Throughout the 19th century, the popes kept condemning liberalism in the most virulent of terms, calling it, akin to atheism. Incredible litany of abusive terms were used to describe liberalism by the Pope and his spokesman. So, there are aspects of Protestantism that lend themselves to a kind of secularization and that become liberal principles, like the focus on the individual. In Protestantism, there is more focus on the individual and his or her relationship to God, the focus on reading. My liberals, the ones I write about, were very much for critical thinking and believed that part of the Protestants' sort of gift to the world, and they did think of it as a gift, as a higher form of religion than Catholicism, rightly or wrongly. They believed that it inspired and encouraged critical thinking skills, which are so important to an engaged citizenry. And they said this repeatedly. Protestantism is a higher form of religion, they said, because it encourages the individual to grapple with deep truths themselves, to learn how to read and to communicate and to think critically. And this is what we need in a liberal polity.
Interesting. That almost sounds like it has elements of Hinduism in it, which
Oh, really?
encourage you to follow. Well, yeah, it sort of encourages you to follow your individual path, right? In fact, Hinduism is quite disorganized, other than when sort of right-wing nuts get together and start doing bad things.
Yeah.
But, people don't even pray at the same time. There are no common hours of worship. If you go to a temple, it's a constant stream of mild chaos. And in fact, your description of sort of the Catholic Church and its communication almost made me think that was the Catholic version of a fatwa. So it almost sounded like that.
Oh dear, I'm going to get in trouble with Catholics now.
or rather, I'm going to get in trouble.
Well, I do want to stress that there were plenty of Catholics who were liberals, and Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
No,
complicated
if
story.
anyone's going to get into trouble, I am, and probably with Catholics, Hindus, and Muslims at this point. So,
And there were
anyway.
plenty of, there were plenty of so-called Orthodox Protestants who looked down on these other liberal Protestants, the ones that call themselves liberal, and said, you're not Christians at all, you're not Protestants at all. What you say you worship is not even a religion. You've watered it down to the point where it's nothing to do with Christianity. So there was this debate going on throughout, and
Right,
it
right.
continues to today, doesn't it?
Indeed it does. So what does history tell us about what's worked and what hasn't worked? What does the history of liberal democracy tell us? Like, what can we take and apply to our current situation now, where we have all this sort of populism and technology being sort of used in all kinds of nefarious ways? Like, is there anything we can learn from history that can serve as a guide going forward?
Well, thanks for that. I think we can learn a lot from history. It gives us perspective. It shows us kind of what's worked and hasn't in the past. You can't directly forecast the future. As a historian, we're very careful with that. And hopefully, I think I certainly know my limitations. But I would say that what has worked for liberals in the past has been when they have been able to be pragmatic and negotiate, even with people with views different from their own. Madame de Stael was a wonderful early liberal, and she was famous for inviting into her drawing room people of different persuasions, very different persuasions, royalists, republicans, sort of all around the table, and she tried to find common ground. That is a pragmatic position that I think is a good one and has worked. Liberals have been pragmatists in the past, and this has sometimes made them, and moderates, and that's made them kind of seem a little mamby-pamby from times. They're neither socialists nor conservatives, they're somewhere in between, but that can be a strength as well. Now, when they are, however, on the other side, if they are completely divided amongst themselves, if they can't come to agreement on virtually anything that they stand for, then that's obviously a recipe for disaster. And it's happened a couple of times when liberals also have not adapted to the problems at hand. When in the 19th century, for example, they didn't adjust quickly enough to problems with workers, with poverty and so on, you have the labor movement grow, socialism grows, and they're too slow to adapt. So liberals have repeatedly, in order to be successful, re-articulated themselves, rethought what they must do, what their policies should do, and that's when they've been successful. Adapt to circumstances, rethink their core priorities, and I think that has to happen again today. Things have changed. The problems are not the same. We have this revolution that you're talking about, automation, artificial intelligence, the internet. I
Well,
think we need.
we've got tremendous polarization, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing that's driving people apart, right? Is that we've sort of seen this, rise, and where the sort of this righteous element on both sides, and people are sort of in their own echo chambers, right? Have we had similar
Oh yeah.
periods in
Yeah, yeah.
history? These
Yes, of
similar echo
course.
chambers?
I don't know about echo chambers. I mean, that's very much sort of a modern concept, I think, related to the internet. But I mean, of course, there's been a terrible. I mean, people were shooting each other rather, and terrible animosity from the beginning of our systems of government. People have not been friendly or polite with one another. So that is nothing new. I think really it's more the effect of this on the electorate, on children. I don't even know how we can resolve it. I mean, in the past, I think that's the real problem. Come to think of it, is that we feel we don't even know what is the solution. Smart people like you who are in this field have trouble, if I may say, deciding, understandably, how to fix this problem. That this brave new world is something we can't even understand. It's beyond our comprehension, and it's moving so quickly. Things are changing so fast.
So things are changing incredibly fast in terms of humanity's relationship with technology at every level, from individual to societal. But we're still trying to understand the large-scale influences of different kinds of matching and amplification algorithms on people. And big tech has 10 times the legal firepower as the Department of Justice. So lawmakers have been doubly paralyzed in figuring out what to do about them. Talking about paralysis, I referred earlier to our less than stellar record in handling the COVID crisis relative to countries like South Korea, which had a much more sort of centralized and organized response to COVID, while Americans struggle to achieve agreement on basic things like wearing masks. There's a great 7-minute video on YouTube of Justice Scalia talking about why gridlock is a strength of our liberal democracy. So is our disjointed response to the COVID crisis something we should expect generally from a liberal democracy in times of crises?
I think that the problem is not so much the system. Gridlock is always a bad thing, I think. I think there's something in our culture in America that is all about protecting people from the government. And there's a certain amount of this in liberal democracy. The early problem was this absolute monarchy, intrusive government, regulations that were basically feudal that they wanted to get rid of. But there's been this fear, this idea that you have to protect the individual from a government that's going to interfere in your life or with your rights. And I think this is in America more than anywhere else. You mentioned South Korea, but right now, I'm in Australia, and they've had incredible, and it's a liberal democracy, a thriving liberal democracy, and they've been incredibly successful with the COVID, and very few relatively deaths, and they've been extremely strict to jump through hoops to get here to see my family. And there have been lockdown after lockdown. And yet the people have accepted it. Yes, there's been some demonstrations. Yes, now they're quite tired because for 2 years they've been doing this. But they have accepted it and they trust their government. I don't know why there's this tremendous distrust of government in America, which I think has fed into, the reaction we've had and the inability to really get control, where people in America are even saying they have a right not to get vaccinated. And so there's deep cultural issues involved too, I think, Vasant.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because, I think a healthy skepticism of government is okay and it's a good thing. But I think you're right. I think it's sort of misplaced. I don't think government is necessarily, as big a threat to liberal democracy at the moment as
That's
is,
right.
The way the internet is evolving. And,
Exactly.
And we don't completely understand this new animal, but unless we do, I suspect that the real threat may come from another source. And while we're sort of focused on government and individual rights, maybe we're ignoring the real problem that's emerging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I totally agree. Yeah.
So what does all of this tell us for how we should think about education, right? Both of us are educators in very different areas. My area is in tech. I teach in a business school. You're an intellectual historian. How should we be thinking about education? What's the role of humanities? And while I'm asking you that, I sense that, perhaps some part of the humanities are in a bit of a crisis or...
You're so right. It is very important to think about education and how we are educating the young, especially at this time. Things are changing so rapidly. I'm a history professor, and we do in the humanities feel like we're a little bit under siege. There's so much talk about STEM, about technology, about science, about all of that. And of course it's important. And I actually feel that we need, you were talking earlier about how all your students know about cryptocurrencies and the internet and platforms and all of this. Well, my students do not generally. There are now departments called the digital humanities where they're learning things, but we're woefully slow. And certainly I'm like a dinosaur when it comes to this new technology. So I do believe believe that yes, we need to up our our knowledge of these new technologies, and science is important. But let's please not forget the humanities. It's so important to know history. Students should be encouraged and taught, history courses. Take a course in philosophy, literature, the arts. Let's, if I were to give somebody ever asked me for some advice, I would say that I would encourage students not to be so quick to choose, to worry about a career, to think rather about things that can really enrich their lives in the long term, and that do develop character, and encourage you to ask the big questions. Humanities, I've been thinking a lot about this. Humanities has humanity in it. It's something that causes us to really reflect on who we are, what we are as human beings, to ask the big questions, to ask, where are we going as a society? Have we taken a wrong turn? What would a right turn be? These big, important questions we need to grapple with, along with understanding technology, all the rest of it. And so I get back to, what I love to do is to read the classics, read the big books, the important books, the great books.
Well said. In fact, you reminded me of an earlier conversation I'd had with Michael Roth about this. And he was of a similar opinion, that liberal arts education, sort of furnishes the mind. There's some quote like that. I'm not remembering it correctly. And he in fact did tell me that, yes, it's okay for tech people like you to prepare people for a job, but life's broader than that. And I completely agree. There's a famous Bob Marley quote, which I'll adapt, which I'll say, if you don't know your history, you'll never know where you're coming from. I completely agree. I advise people to these days study philosophy and study, computing if they can. But I agree. I think, without an appreciation of history and the classics, one isn't completely educated. So on that front, do you sort of get this reaction about the classics that why are we studying these dead white men, that maybe we should be studying something else? Do you ever get that? Because I've heard that.
Yeah, I do a lot. Of course, it is the great books have mostly been written by, or the ones we study anyway, in the Western tradition, have been written by men that are dead and were mostly white. Still, I just think that they are fabulous to grapple with. They have a lot to teach us. They dealt with the big ideas. Yes, there are flaws in their thinking for sure, but I tell students to of course we should acknowledge this. But there's so much good in what they had to say. They pushed the ball forward. They caused people to open their minds and to grapple again with the big issues. And I encourage students to think, yeah, okay, they had these prejudices, they had these flaws. What are our own flaws? Where is it that we are assuming stuff? And let's stop being so condescending and assume that we are better than these people who are very often trying to improve the world, and really encouraging people to think about human nature, or think about the big problems. Yeah, so I think there's always, they've survived the centuries for a reason. They speak to us in terms that we can understand this with problems that are still ours today. Yeah, and it's not, when I teach them and when we teach the great thinkers, we don't just worship them and think that everything they said is perfect and we should take at face value. No, but they have ways of causing us to think and stir up the mind and give us create great conversations between us about important problems that are still ours today. So I'm not sure I'm repeating myself, but I cannot be more insistent that they are that great books courses should be taught and maybe even required in American colleges.
Well said, and I couldn't agree more. One of the things that I learned from your book is that the current state of our liberal democracy has emerged from really messy periods of trial and error, and that the great thinkers reflect on humanity's challenges during these periods, and as you say, push the ball forward and try to open people's minds to improve the world. I mean, I get that individual liberties and rights have been hard won, and it's important to think carefully about how to protect and shape them, especially in today's brave new world of tech, changing norms, and globalization. I mean, how we communicate and live has changed dramatically, but many of the core issues are the same, such as rights, protections, obligations, what it means to be a good citizen in a free society, and above all, to quote unquote, stir up the mind to create the right kinds of conversations going forward. These will continue to be relevant in the brave new world of tech. Really good stuff. Well, Helena, it's been a pleasure having you on the pod, and thanks for sticking through some of those technical glitches that we had. But hopefully they weren't too bad.
Thank you very much, Vasant. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.